Tonight, we're going to imagine a world just slightly different from our own. A world where one invention never left the scrolls and alchemical workshops of ancient China. One spark that never became a fire. What if China never invented gunpowder? Let's find out slowly together. The sun dipped gently below the horizon of the Central Plains, casting long ochre shadows across the tiled roofs of Luoyang. A soft wind rustled the bamboo blinds of the scholars' pavilion, where a young man, Shen Biao, knelt over a silk scroll. Ink pooled at the tip of his brush, unmoving, as if unsure whether to descend. His master, a man with eyes like quiet wells and hands that bore the scars of 30 winters, stood behind him in silence. Shen Biao was not merely a student of philosophy. He was, by his father's will, a destined servant of the Hanlin Academy. The Song dynasty was at its intellectual peak, a time when the Mandarinate flourished, and when learning, not violence, settled disputes. But it was also a time of vulnerability, a time when the borders were less guarded by walls of fire and more by diplomacy, tribute, and meticulous record-keeping. For in this version of the world, the dark powder black as night, volatile as lightning, was never coaxed into being. The Taoist alchemists, so close to discovering the incendiary mix of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, had instead veered into gentler pursuits. The flame was not bound to bamboo tubes, nor were rockets ever hurled into the sky. Instead, incense remained sacred. Fire, a force of domesticity and spiritual purification, never took on the form of destruction. And thus, warfare, when it came, was slower. Siege engines creaked and strained. Armies marched not with thundering echoes, but with the rustling of armor and the shouted orders of men. The Mongols, still riders of the steppe, still sons of Genghis, rose as they always had, but their campaigns were different now. No thunderclap of hand cannons announced their sieges. Their tactics evolved along older paths, more focused on deception, encirclement, starvation. Without gunpowder, the walls of Chinese cities stood longer, their wooden gates reinforced with iron and stone. But even the strongest gates cannot forever resist hunger, nor the fear that creeps in with each silent, unopposed night. Shen Biao dipped his brush, finally, and began writing not of military tactics, but of courtly obligations. A minor conflict had erupted in the south, in the lands near what we would today call Vietnam, where a border prince had refused tribute. The emperor wished to send envoys first, soldiers second. It was the Confucian way. Power through harmony, harmony through hierarchy. The emperor, known to his people as the Radiant Balance, believed deeply in the virtue of cultural influence. If the border tribes could be shown the elegance of song music, the delicacy of song poetry, and the superiority of its irrigation techniques, they might yield without blood. There was wisdom in this belief. But wisdom, like stone, wears thin under the water of reality. In the forests to the west, in the damp hills of Yunnan, whispers spread of peoples who did not fear porcelain or scrolls. Tribes still followed the old rhythms of the earth. They had learned to forge iron well enough, and lacking the thunder of guns, they turned to more intricate cruelty traps, poisons, sudden raids. In a world without explosions, death came quietly, knives rather than fire. And sometimes, that silence was far more terrifying. But the absence of gunpowder did not merely alter battles. It changed time itself. In Europe, the towers of fortified cities remained unbothered by cannonballs. The 100 Years' War, still long, still brutal, unfolded with slower suffering. Crossbows retained their dominance longer, and knights, armored and arrogant, persisted in their role far past their due. Naval warfare across the globe evolved into a chessboard of sail and blade. There were no ship-mounted guns, no broadsides that could shatter a hull with a single shot. The age of exploration came later, and when it did, it arrived not with the blast of muskets, but with quieter dread. Colonialism, when it spread, took longer to root. Resistance had more time. The conquistadors who once toppled empires with gunfire now faced a more even struggle. Back in Luoyang, as Chen Biao packed away his inkstone, he could not have imagined that the work he had just completed, an administrative report about grain ties, would one day lie in a box carried by a refugee fleeing a city under siege. That scroll, wrapped in cloth, would survive long after the city did not. For one night, many years later, a new army would arrive at Luoyang's gates, not with fire, but with rope ladders and silence. But let us not leap ahead. In the north, in the lands that once birthed nomads and whispering winds, the Mongol tribes continued to evolve. Deprived of the shock and awe of explosive warfare, they had sharpened other tools: logistics, horse breeding, tactical flexibility. When Genghis Khan finally rode to the Yellow River, he did not bring fire with him, but he brought speed, coordination, and hunger. His forces split and converged like river tributaries. They struck supply lines, then faded like ghosts. They offered peace to cities that opened their gates, and utter silence to those that resisted. Gunpowder, in the world we know, had served as both a sword and shield. Without it, the burden fell upon other sciences. Chinese engineers, freed from developing bombs or firearms, had focused more deeply on hydraulics, clockwork, and agricultural innovation. The South was now a vast patchwork of rice paddies, fed by complex irrigation systems. Starvation was rare. Disease, however, was not. Medicine had made strides, but not leaps. On the 14th day of the 9th lunar month, the emperor summoned his inner court. He had heard reports of a strange fever spreading in the border provinces. Without the craters and scars of war, was often illness that redrew maps. This new fever, without a known pattern, was moving faster than expected. Couriers arrived late, or not at all. Entire villages stopped sending taxes. That, more than anything, drew the emperor's concern. He ordered a delegation of scholar physicians to travel south. Among them was the now older Chen Biao, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes tired but firm. Their goal was not to burn or bomb the infections. Such tools did not exist. Instead, they would observe, record, treat if they could, quarantine if they must. Along the muddy roads of the Yangtze Valley, Chen Bo's party encountered what one might call the limits of peace. In the absence of explosive force, violence did not vanish. It simply took subtler forms. Bandits who once would have feared rifles now used spears and stealth. Merchants hired more guards. Poisonings were common. The world was slower, but no less sharp. And yet, for all its dangers, this world held a serenity that ours may never know. The stars at night were clearer, the forests less scorched. Temples remained whole, glassware survived. In the absence of gunpowder, the artifacts of time lasted longer, and so did memories. At a river crossing, Shin Biao met a boy who had never seen war. He was 14, bright and barefoot, with a mind full of questions about how boats floated and why stars shimmered. In our world, that boy might have been pressed into service, handed a musket, and sent into smoke. Here, he asked about currents. He asked about stories. He asked about how cities are born. Chen Biao, tired though he was, smiled and explained the architecture of bridges. The child listened. The river flowed. And far from them, in a place where history bent just slightly from our own, a future waited, a future shaped not by black powder and fire, but by ink, water, and wind. But the winds were shifting. In the west, a caravan had arrived in Kashgar bearing strange news. European traders Venetians, most likely, had reached the eastern steppe with a gift not of gold or glass, but of a new material. A crystal that, when struck, sparked. A powder, white and dense, that burned fast. Not gunpowder, no, but something close, something new. And as these foreign alchemies reached Chinese ears, Debates began to stir in court. Should they investigate? Should they fear it? Should they use it? Chun Bio, now an old man, wrote one last report. It read simply, "We abandoned fire to preserve balance." But balance cannot exist forever in a world that keeps shifting. We must choose anew, not from fear, but from understanding. Then he set down his brush, and the ink, this time, dried slowly in the evening air. The embassy that arrived at Chang'an's Western Gate in the early spring of the year of the Jade Rabbit was unlike any delegation the empire had received before. They were not emissaries from old tributary states, nor traders from familiar lands such as Annam or Kompa. They spoke with thick tongues and wore unfamiliar woolen cloaks. Their letters of passage were written in flowing Latin script, barely decipherable even to the most skilled of the court interpreters. These were Venetians, though they bore no arms. They carried maps inked with places the Middle Kingdom had never named. And among the silks and minerals in their pack animal's burden was a satchel of pale powder, wrapped tightly in oilcloth and sealed with wax. The Song court received them with the expected grace. Guests were seated, rice wine was poured, and dancers moved like mist between columns of painted lacquer. But beneath the veneer of ritual, tension brewed. The substance they brought was not explosive in the sense of gunpowder. It did not ignite from flame alone, but when sparked by friction, or when mixed with certain oils, it produced a violent burst of heat and light. One of the imperial chemists, after careful experimentation, declared that it might be used to send signals across great distances. Another quietly mused that it could ignite an entire storehouse if mishandled. The emperor, now an aging man burdened by the steady decline of the southern provinces, asked only one question: what purpose does this serve that we cannot already fulfill? The room was silent. The Venetian translator, a wiry man with sunburned cheeks and trembling fingers, eventually replied, "To make your enemies think twice before striking." This answer displeased the court philosophers. The empire had long followed a vision of cultivated strength, one rooted in the balance of nature, the clarity of reason, and the elegance of bureaucracy. Even during wars, harmony was the guiding ideal. It was believed that true power was silent, and true wisdom required restraint. The idea of a weapon that inspired fear through spectacle, not skill, bordered on barbarism. Yet the question remained, if others were to wield such forces, could China afford not to? Already, rumors circulated of small states in the West, where these powders were being refined into rudimentary flares, incendiary pastes, and perhaps more. The Mongol scouts had taken notice. So too had the Tibetan monks, who saw the material as a potential sacrament, a way to light their sky altars in radiant fire during rites of ascension. But here, in the heart of China, the court was slow to act. The empire had survived centuries without fire lances or bombards. Their strength was in roads, rivers, books, and patience. Still, some within the Ministry of Rites suggested a quiet experiment: send a small delegation of natural philosophers to learn the properties of this European fire. Not to weaponize, they insisted, but to understand. Thus, a man named Li Huai was chosen for the task. Li Huai was not a warrior. He was a hydrologist by trade, a scholar who had once helped reroute the floods of the Min River using only bamboo scaffolding and weighted stones. But he possessed a restless mind and a deep curiosity about the unseen mechanisms of the world. He and 3 assistants departed under the guise of a trade mission, traveling westward along the ancient Silk roads, through dusty towns and sun-bleached valleys, eventually reaching the city of Samarkand. There, amidst domes of turquoise tile and bustling markets, Li Huai found the first glimpses of what the absence of Chinese gunpowder had meant elsewhere. In the Islamic world, fire had remained largely a symbol of divine illumination. Without explosive powder to drive an arms race, much of the Muslim world had invested even more deeply in optics, astronomy, and complex mechanical devices. In a small observatory near Bukhara, Li Huai saw an orrery powered by water pressure, mapping the motion of Venus to within half a day's accuracy. In Persia, he encountered a group of artisans who had developed a kind of flash painting, chemicals that, when exposed to bright sunlight mixed with the Venetian powder, would leave a faint impression on specially treated parchment. It was the earliest glimmer of photography, and Li Huai realized then that while the powder could bring fire, it could also bring light. Yet even as he studied, as he learned, the balance he had known in China began to shift. Back home, the emperor had died. His son, enthroned at the age of 32, had been raised on tales of the Mongol threat, of vanished border towns, of caravans robbed by night. Where his father had seen patience as strength, he saw it as weakness. The empire, he believed, had grown too comfortable, too inward. And though he respected the teachings of the sages, he also respected the finality of conquest. Upon Li Huai's return, he was greeted not with garlands, but with urgency. His research was to be shared with a new Office of Military Application, housed in a discreet compound outside Hanzhou. The powder was now called Mingyan Bright Flame, and it was to be studied for military and signaling use. Li Huai protested. He wrote long scrolls arguing that the substance was unstable, and its spiritual cost would outweigh its utility. He described what he had seen in Samarkand, not destruction, but light, art, discovery. His pleas were archived, then ignored. The first Mingyan lanterns were lit not for festivals, but to test their visibility across mountain ridges during drills. Later, experiments in sealed bronze tubes were conducted. There were no guns, yet China still lacked the impulse to mechanize killing, but there were signs. Rumors. Farmers near the southern barracks reported thunder without clouds. Fishermen spoke of flashes on the hillsides, where no lightning had struck. The scholars of the Hanlin Academy debated ethics, but the new emperor did not consult them. He moved swiftly, surrounded by ministers who spoke the language of necessity. And so, a transformation began? It was not as sudden as in our timeline, but it was no less consequential. A world that had, for centuries, evolved without the sword of fire now stood at a threshold. And though the gate opened slowly, it could not remain closed. Still, the world had not yet burned. In the distant valleys of Sichuan, tea farmers continued their rituals, plucking leaves before dawn, steaming them gently, drying them on woven trays. In the canals of Suzhou, lovers still floated past lantern-lit bridges, whispering poems from memory. The soul of China, its music, its philosophy, its taste for slow, deliberate time endured. But a new heartbeat had begun, quieter for now, but growing. One afternoon, Li Huai visited the grave of his first teacher, a monk who had once told him that the future always comes with both hands, one open, one closed. Standing beneath the cypress trees, he wondered which hand the empire had just taken. The year that followed became known in court records as the Year of Distant Thunder. Officially, it referred to a series of unusually dry lightning storms that passed over the hills of northern Hunan. But to those who worked in the deeper folds of the new imperial bureaucracy, scribes, engineers, messengers, it referred to something else entirely: the quiet testing of flame. No official decree was issued. No public demonstrations were held. The Song dynasty still cherished the idea of itself as a civilizing force, not a conquering one. Yet somewhere outside the capital, in a valley guarded by pine trees and forgotten tombs, a small compound had been established where strange things occurred. Bronze tubes were forged, not to pour water, but to hold mixtures of mineral powder. Iron spheres were shaped, not for carpentry or balance scales, but for weight and pressure. And gradually, with caution born from centuries of restraint, fire began to speak. But fire has a memory. It remembers what it was meant to be. And there were those who heard it differently. In the northern steppes, Mongol scouts watched the southern merchants more carefully now. They heard stories from borderland smugglers of strange new tools, of caravans transporting powders too tightly sealed to be medicinal. The Khans, always pragmatic, held counsel in the stone shade of Karakoram. They still revered the speed of horses, the bow, the wind, but even they knew that time favored those who listened closely. Meanwhile, in the mountains of Tibet, where Buddhist monasteries clung to cliffsides like spiderwebs of prayer, the news traveled slower. There, scholars debated not the utility of fire, but its meaning. One aged monk wrote, "Fire born of the ground is different from fire born of the soul. The first feeds the hearth, the second consumes it." His disciples copied these words onto long paper scrolls and tucked them into the walls of shrines. But outside the cloister, trade caravans were shifting. European merchants, long blocked by the labyrinth of permissions and taxes, now found new opportunities. The Song dynasty, anxious to remain ahead of its neighbors, had opened experimental ports along the southern coast. Here in the humid air of what would one day be known as Macau's strange goods began to accumulate glass mirrors, shaped in ways no Chinese artisan would consider elegant, but which distorted light into patterns of strategic interest. Brass lenses clumsy, yet capable of magnifying distant hillsides, and most importantly sealed barrels of the new white powder. The powder did not yet have a proper name. The Chinese called it Mingyan, the Venetians Kale's Befulmen lightning chalk. The Arabs, who had first isolated it from volcanic ash and salt flats, referred to it simply as Sir al-Barak, the secret of lightning. No one truly owned it. It belonged to the age itself. Back inland, Chun Bo's grandson Shun Wei had taken up his grandfather's place within the Hamlin Academy. But the academy was not what it once had been. It was still a place of learning, but now it lived in the shadow of a new department, the Bureau of Strategic Innovation. Its scholars wore darker robes, traveled with guards, and spoke little at banquets. Chun Wei, for his part, remained dedicated to the old rhythms. He studied water flow, manuscript preservation, and musical theory. But he could not ignore the shift. One afternoon, while reviewing trade manifests from the southeastern ports, he noticed a recurring pattern. Shipments listed as foreign incense salt, arriving in increasing volume, always routed through the same military inspection point, always bound inland toward unknown facilities. He inquired, gently, quietly. A colleague, trusted since their student days, told him only this: the emperor believes the future cannot be waited for. It must be carried. Chun Wei walked home slowly that evening, past the stone bridges and lanterned pavilions, past street performers singing of old victories and boatmen mumbling about river spirits. He saw a world still shaped by ink and bamboo, but beneath it, a tension built unspoken, but unmistakable. A single sound in the wrong place might change everything. Elsewhere, the world listened. In the Japanese court, envoys reported back on the strange foreign flame now flickering in the south. The shogunate had kept Japan largely isolated, preserving its own systems of defense and philosophy. But the arrival of European traders, particularly Portuguese and Genoese, was beginning to stir waters long kept still. The Japanese, fascinated by metallurgy and pattern, began to experiment with their own mineral mixtures. A monk in Kyoto wrote a treatise comparing fire to the discipline of swordcraft, both swift, both absolute. In the Islamic empires, debate was far less spiritual. There, among the scholars of Cairo and Baghdad, a bitter realization had set in. Their long alliance with learning had led them close to this substance centuries earlier, but without the political will to exploit it. Now, others would, and the balance of the world might shift again, this time not through philosophy, but through ignition. Back in China, the testing continued. At first, the Mingyan powder was used to develop signal flares, long-burning, brightly colored torches designed to communicate over mountain ranges. They were elegant in design, combining layers of resin, dye, and mineral salts, and their use was restricted to border patrols and naval fleets. But soon, someone asked a different question. What if the fire could move? And so, the first crude rockets were born not weapons, but messengers. Cylinders of bamboo, sealed at one end, packed with a controlled portion of the bright burning powder. When lit, they soared unevenly, often exploding mid-air or veering wildly into forests. But every fourth or fifth attempt went straight and far. Li Huai, now nearing 70, was summoned to witness one of these trials. He stood on a grassy hill outside the city of Yong, a place where cicadas droned and children played along irrigation ditches. When the signal was given, a long stick was lit and lowered into a small trench. There was a pause, then a sharp hiss. The rocket lifted shaking, wobbling, and arced across the blue sky before plummeting into a field, where it struck a scarecrow with enough force to knock it over. Everyone clapped, except Li Huai. He turned to the young engineers and said only, "You are building wings for fire. Do not forget that fire has never been our servant, only our guest." But guests grow restless. Soon after, the Bureau of Strategic Innovation drafted a new project, Chariot Flame. These would not be fireworks. They would be projectiles, metal-tipped, carried in baskets by runners, or mounted in bundles on wooden carts. Their purpose was simple: to break a charge, to scatter cavalry, to burn dry grass ahead of advancing troops. It was not yet war, but it was no longer only study. And then, almost imperceptibly, something changed. A small rebellion in the southwestern province of Guizhou, led by a coalition of minority tribes who had long resisted central taxes, forced the empire's hand. At first, standard protocol was followed: negotiators, grain gifts, promises. But when the tribal leaders attacked a tax outpost and killed 3 officials, the emperor responded with force. The Southern Army, better trained than most, but still untested in fire deployment, was ordered to bring the Mingyan carts. Not many, just 6. The battle at Tunlan Hill was brief. The rebels, lightly armed, were caught off guard by the sound. The first rockets fizzled, but the second and third flew true. The field caught fire. The rebel lines broke. 30 were killed, not many, but enough. The rest fled into the hills. Reports were written. The victory was praised. The fire, it was said, had roared in the emperor's name. But in the villages near Tianling, the peasants spoke of something else: smoke that clung to the throat, ash that would not wash from clothes, children who screamed at night. The wind had changed, and though it carried no cannon thunder, it carried something heavier, something irreversible. After Qinglong Hill, nothing changed, at least not on the surface. The court did not celebrate. No proclamations were made. The Mingyan carts were returned to their storage facilities without ceremony, and the young general who had commanded the southern detachment was neither promoted nor scolded. The empire maintained its face. But in the weeks that followed, something subtle shifted. Within the imperial archives, certain scrolls were moved from open shelves to restricted vaults. The Bureau of Strategic Innovation quietly doubled its workforce. And on a windswept terrace high above Hangzhou, a series of private demonstrations were conducted, attended by men whose names would never appear in public ledgers, and whose robes bore no insignia. Chun Wei, now well into his 40s, observed all of this from the margins. He had not spoken of Mingyan since his brief inquiry the previous year. His official duties remained unchanged, supervising document preservation, curating ancient maps, translating the occasional Sanskrit manuscript. But at night, he wrote letters. Long, careful letters to distant friends in monastic libraries, in maritime schools, in the private academies of Fuzhou and Shansha. None of them mentioned fire directly, but all of them asked, in some form, a single question: when do ideas stop serving harmony and begin serving fear. Few dared to answer plainly. Some replied with riddles, others with silence. And yet, as weeks turned to months, it became impossible to ignore what was taking root. New terminologies entered the bureaucratic lexicon: ignition timing, blast radius, controlled burn trajectory. Workshops were expanded to accommodate new alloys. Not yet weapons, never called as such, but devices of deterrence. Always this careful language, always this distance. Then came the autumn that historians would later mark as a turning point, though few at the time understood why. In the highlands of Gansu, where the air was dry and roads clung to mountains like brushstrokes on stone, a Mongol warband crossed into imperial territory. It was not a formal invasion, just 40 men, perhaps seeking horses and food. But they raided a frontier garrison, killed a tax official, and took several hostages. Word reached the capital within a week. By imperial edict, a response was drafted, but this time no army was sent. Instead, a single cart, drawn by oxen, made the journey to the provincial border. At dusk, under the watch of 2 junior officers and 4 engineers, it was wheeled into position along a ridge overlooking a known Mongol encampment. A scroll was tied to a pole and planted near the trail. "Return our people. Leave our soil. This is our only warning." The cart was opened. A single barrel was removed. Its core had been packed with a denser variant of Mingyan, sealed behind a copper plate. A delay fuse was lit. What followed was not the firestorm of modern artillery. No city was flattened, no crater left behind. But it was enough. Enough to shake the stones, to send a deafening crack down the valley, to set dry bush alight and panic the horses. Enough to prove a principle, that fire could be held, guided, hurled. Not with elegance, perhaps, but with certainty. The Mongols vanished by morning. The hostages were released, unharmed, with their hands bound in tribute cloth. It was the quietest of victories. But quiet victories, too, leave scars. When Shun Wei read the report, weeks later buried in a crate of mundane trade filings, he felt the same dull ache his grandfather had, described years ago, in the margins of the scroll, now long hidden from view. "We learn the nature of fire not by watching it dance," it said, "but by watching what it leaves behind when it's gone." The emperor, for his part, made no grand pronouncement. He simply called for more investment in what he now referred to as deterrent infrastructure. Along the rivers, small bunkers were constructed to house sealed barrels of Mingyan. In the southern hills, lookout towers were equipped with mirrored signaling devices and pre-packed fire launchers, still officially designated as fog-clearing tools. The language of civil function continued to veil the unfolding of military potential. But the people, always more attuned than the court believed, began to understand. In the villages, rumors bloomed like algae on stagnant ponds. Children dared one another to visit fireplaces in the forest, where soot-stained stones marked the edge of test sites. Old men whispered of soldiers with iron gloves and no shadows. Merchants began carrying amulets against the dragon wind, a superstition born from tales of invisible fire that leapt without warning and blackened rice crops overnight. The poets, too, responded. One evening, during the annual Lantern Festival, a minor scholar named Zuo Yelin stood on a bridge in Suzhou and recited a verse that would later be banned in 3 provinces. "Lanterns once rose to summon spring. Now spring is summoned by fire and string. We light the sky not for joy, but for warning, and joy, once warned, does not return." The audience applauded politely. By morning, Zuo Yelin had vanished. Some said he fled to the western provinces. Others said he was given a position in the Bureau of Innovation, quietly silenced by elevation. And all the while, the stars continued their slow revolutions above. The world had not ended. No empire had fallen. No great war had begun. Trade still flowed. Marriages were still arranged. Crops still rose and fell with the rain. But a boundary had been crossed, not loudly, not proudly, but with the patience of 1,000 careful steps. The powder that had once been thought impossible, or at least irrelevant to the Middle Kingdom, now hummed quietly beneath its soil. Not everywhere, not openly, but enough. Enough to mean that the next time a threat arose, fire would answer first. And perhaps, most silently of all, the very idea of China had changed. Not in its art, not yet. Not in its music or cuisine, but in its posture. A civilization that once measured strength by stillness, now measured it, sometimes by spectacle. The fire that had once been a guest now occupied a room of its own. Still, in the distant monasteries of the north, monks rang bells at dawn. In the tea hills of Anhui, leaves were plucked before the sun had fully crested the ridge. On the banks of the Yangtze, old couples walked hand in hand, speaking softly about the weather and the cost of radish. History had changed, but life, as it always does, persisted. For now, far to the west of the Middle Kingdom, where the cold breath of the Atlantic slips between pine forests and cobbled towns, Europe stirred. But it did not roar. It moved like a sleeping beast, woken early and spring eyes half closed, limbs reluctant. The lack of Chinese gunpowder had stilled a century that, in our world, ignited with fire and smoke. Fortresses still crowned hilltops. Night still ruled by oath and steel. Artillery so devastatingly early in our history remained a curious idea, whispered in alchemical workshops, but never realized on fields of war. In Italy, the city-states rose in rivalry. Yes, but their wars were waged with precision, not fire. The crossbow retained its throne, the pike its rhythm. Armor grew heavier. Architects like Brunelleschi, who in another timeline might have diverted genius to build bastions against cannon fire, now focused on domes, aqueducts, and the sacred dance between light and space. Florence shone with art, not with smoke. And yet, knowledge flowed. The Venetian envoys who once brought Ming into China had not done so blindly. They were part of a web thin, but growing of intellectual adventurers, traders, apothecaries, and translators who moved between Cairo, Constantinople, Damascus, and Alexandria, ferrying not only silk and jewels, but minerals, theories, and dust. In Cairo's Dar al-Ilm, the house of knowledge, an aging mathematician named Ibrahim al-Fazari had begun categorizing volatile compounds not for war, but for architecture. His dream was to create a form of controlled combustion to help remove rock in narrow cliff passes, to assist in the carving of mountain roads for caravans. It was, in his words, a flame not to conquer, but to shape. The sultans funded it cautiously. The Ottomans, only now gathering strength, were still consolidating trade routes. And their military, steeped in the discipline of archers and cavalry, saw no need for fireboxes. But among the scholars, the idea took root. In the libraries of Fez and Marrakesh, manuscripts began to appear hand-copied, redacted, annotated describing, not weapons but instruments, flares for ship navigation, mineral torches for night excavation, signal pouches that could be thrown into canyons to summon echoes and measure their depth. It was a world where the powder born slowly, as if unsure of its role, had yet to become a killer. But all substances eventually reflect the will of the hands that hold them. And Europe, for all its cathedrals and carols, held many such hands. In a cold monastery overlooking the Rhine, a Benedictine friar named Matthias von Lichtenfeld recorded in his codex a series of illuminations, sparked by mineral combustion. He had heard rumors of Arab alchemists and Chinese lantern scholars. He combined their teachings with local minerals bat guano, oak charcoal, sulfur scraped from cave mouths, and began testing. He was no soldier. His interest lay in signs, divine, mathematical, astronomical. But his notes were precise. He wrote of powders that leap, stones that roar, and glows that bloom without wood. At first, he imagined church bells triggered by fire-holy smoke made functional. But his writings, like all things, escaped the walls. By the time they reached Prague, they had acquired a new tone. The Bohemian guilds, always curious, had their own reasons for interest. Mining operations in the hills needed cheaper means of breaking stone. And so the first practical application of the powder came not in war, but in labor. Bundled in clay pots, it was used to weaken stubborn veins of granite. No more pickaxes dulling to sparks. Now the stone cracked with sound. It changed everything, quietly. Across Europe, mountains became slightly easier to move. Tunnels lengthened. Wells deepened. And with that, cities grew first outward, then downward. Cathedrals stood taller not because they needed to impress, but because new methods made it possible. Still, the church frowned upon the flame. Too unpredictable, too close to hell's tone. Its embrace of the powder was always hesitant, cloaked in incense and ritual. It was the merchants, the engineers, and inevitably the kings who saw more. In the court of France, a whisper emerged. If a powder could crack stone, could it not crack walls? It was a slow revelation. Without early gunpowder, the 100 Years' War had stretched even longer, fought more like a series of sieges and chess moves than open slaughter. The English longbow still dominated, but the lack of cannons had given French fortresses an unshakable confidence. Towns like Rouen and Calais remained resolute. They feared arrows, not thunder. But now, in the late 15th century, rumors arrived of a powder that did not need skill, only fire. Of a force that obeyed no banner, no creed. Of a noise that silenced strategy. And soon, the alchemists were summoned. They came with ink-stained robes and unsure hands. They brought ledgers, not swords. But the kings listened. In the bowels of old castles, workshops sprang to life. Charcoal was ground in iron mortar. Sulfur was fetched from distant mines. Saltpeter long used for meat curing was re-examined with nervous precision. It took years. Many trials ended in fire. Several ended in nothing. But one day, in a stone courtyard in Brittany, a tube of iron split open with a sound like the cracking of earth, and the age of noble war began to end. Not with conquest, not yet, but with the idea that a wall was no longer forever. And so, fire took its second breath. The oceans were quiet for a long time. In our world, by the late 15th century, ships groaned under the weight of bronze cannons, and imperial flags were carried not only by wind and sail, but by muzzle flash and volley. Caravels became weapons. Harbors trembled. Islands fell not from storm or starvation, but from steel and fire. But in this world, where China had never invented gunpowder, those winds blew softer. Portugal still dreamed of India. Spain still yearned for gold. But their dreams arrived slower. Their caravels were lighter, their hulls unpierced by cannon mouths. Explorers relied on charm, treaty, and the force of unfamiliar languages. Encounters with coastal kingdoms in Africa and the Indies unfolded like long games of chess, not blitzkrieg. When Vasco da Gama reached Calicut, he carried spices, not gunpowder. His ships were met not with cannon fire, but with suspicion, calculation, and resistance not yet broken by fear. It would be decades before even a single European port took root along the Indian Ocean coast. And when it did, it was leased, never seized. Colonialism, then, did not begin as it had in our world, with explosions and smoke, but with talk, trade, and time. The empires of the sea grew, yes, but they grew like coral, not fire. And sometimes coral breaks before it spreads. The great kingdoms of West Africa, Benin, Mali, Songhai remained strong into the 17th century. Without the sudden arrival of gunfire, their cavalry remained kings of the plains. Their cities held, their scholars wrote. Timbuktu's libraries remained dry, and its domes unblackened by soot. The Americas, too, would feel the difference. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic, he arrived with mirrors, bells, and manuscripts, but no muskets. His weapons were blades and greed alone. Against the vast populations of the Mexica and the Inca, it was not enough. Disease still walked beside him, cruel and indifferent, but conquest could no longer ride in on thunder. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan remained unbroken. Quartz was not a god. He was a diplomat, a hostage, a guest held at arm's length. He left not with gold, but with stories. And the Inca, high in their mountain roads, endured for another century, building bridges not with prisoners, but with rope. For China, all this unfolded with distant gravity. The empire, having reluctantly opened the door to flame, never flung it wide. Its Ming-Yan research continued, but slowly, cautiously. There were no mass-produced guns. There were fire signals, flares, rockets, but not rifles. The Song had passed into Ming, and the Ming into something else, a dynasty that had learned both the power and cost of noise. When the Dutch and Portuguese finally reached Chinese waters, they found ports not of fear, but of preparation. Ambassadors were received in halls, cooled by fans, their ships inspected by engineers, trained in chemistry and etiquette alike. There were no sudden wars. There were treaties. The balance held tenuous, always because the memory of restraint still lived. And across the world, fire became something different. It did not vanish. It could not. But it remained rare. It remained expensive. It remained respected. Wars still happened. Of course they did, but they burned less. They starved more. And they ended with treaties written in ink, not dictated by muzzle. And so the world entered a different modern age. An age where cities were taller, not because they had been rebuilt after cannon sieges, but because they had never been shelled at all, where libraries remained full, not rebuilt from ash, where sound traveled more from music than from war, where innovation was pulled by necessity, not pushed by arms races. There were still empires, still betrayals, still cruelty, but fewer craters and more bridges. In the far twilight of this history, an old man stood beneath a cherry tree in Hangzhou, watching children float paper lanterns on the canal. He had once studied Ming-Yan in his youth, had seen fire curl inside glass, had written reports that were never used. He thought of his ancestors, Chun Bo, Chun Wei, thought of bridges that had not burned, of scrolls that had been read instead of buried, of a world that had taken longer to awaken, but perhaps in that delay had remembered how to dream. As night deepened, the lanterns floated further, their light dimming gently across the water. And the fire, at last, rested,